Hi friends, this is Trish and welcome to Teacher Therapy. Today we have an awesome guest named Kevin and he has so many things that he wants to talk to us about today, so we're just going to go ahead and dive in. So Kevin, why don't you tell us what really got you interested in education?
Well, a lot of things actually. I kind of arrived to it a little bit later at realizing that's the direction I wanted to go, but I would say I had a lot of experiences growing up that led me to it. So growing up, I was a very sensitive kid. So I naturally had a lot of empathy for people. So growing up, I saw suffering around me and in general was just like drawn towards kind of like empathy type work, I didn't know what that meant at that time. When I first went to college, I actually was studying social work. I ended up moving away from that into teaching because I felt I could be more effective and impactful on youth than adults. And that was, I guess, just more kind of like the lane I wanted to be in, like intervene at younger rather than later in life is easier. And yeah, so I got into teaching. I mean, I also like really value education and really enjoyed school growing up. So, I mean, in one sense, I want to make school fun and learning enjoyable because I know that's kind of a thing that a lot of people are struggling with. You can have more success or feel more successful with that the younger you're able to, I guess, have some influence on that in a positive way.
That's awesome. And did you feel like your teacher education program prepared you for what you would face once you got into the classroom?
Not entirely. I would say, so I went to the University of Washington, which I would say that because at the time, I think it was ranked number 4 out of like master's level teaching programs. And I still was a little disappointed, to be honest. But I think it prepared me overall pretty well for like the instructional side of things. I would say it didn't prepare me for the reality of like crazy behaviors I was going to deal with. And it didn't prepare me for the reality that no one was going to back me up. So that was 2 areas that it seems other teachers I've talked to, those were lacking in their programs as well.
So yeah. What would you say then? You kind of alluded to it, but what would you say surprised you the most about the reality of being a teacher versus what you were expecting in your teacher education program?
The first thing I noticed was I was surprised how many parents had a really like hostile adversarial attitude with the school. It seemed like it was like a quarter or a third, like it was like a pretty big portion, bigger than I would have anticipated, which makes things really challenging, right? Just because you need to be able to communicate and connect with the parents. And if they don't see you as like an ally, then you have no influence on them either, right? And it really interferes with your ability to influence their kid in whatever way you're trying to do. And so that I found quite frustrating. And then the second thing was just the lack of discipline in terms of there's just a tolerance of like violence and abuse that to me seemed pretty unacceptable from the beginning. Like things that normal people wouldn't tolerate in normal environments outside of schools, getting called names, getting told you're going to get killed, things like that. There's a lot more aggression and violence than I anticipated. I obviously anticipated some of it because I witnessed some growing up, but it was like a few incidents. It wasn't all the time. And but I was even more surprised with the adults allowing it. Like that was even more disappointing for me. Those are probably the 2 main things I can think of.
So would you say that you saw students fighting with each other? Is that what you mean when you say that you were witnessing violence?
Yeah, and towards adults too. I mean, there was, students fighting. I mean, brief interactions of violence, like throwing chairs at another student or pencils or scissors or things like that. And like also seeing it directed towards adults. Like, I mean, personally, I've been hit, I don't know how many times, been slapped, bit, kids spit in my face, textbooks thrown at me, all kinds of stuff. I've seen students like, here's an example. When I was working as a para, there was this woman who was a para substitute who frequently came to our building to fill in for Subzerd because she liked our building. We had this one boy who was known to be violent and known to specifically intimidate female teachers. And this woman had some sort of muscular skeletal disease. So she walked with a cane and had some difficulty walking. Like a kid who we knew like had a history of violence was paired with her, and he like pushed over this disabled woman. Targeting. Yeah. And I went to my principal. I heard about it, and I was like, "You have to do something about this." And he was like, "Oh, what do you mean?" And I was like, number one, we shouldn't tolerate him doing that to anybody, but specifically like targeting women and intimidating them." And then he did it to another one. He like cornered another woman and made her feel uncomfortable, and it's insane.
So in your school, do they have a discipline system that's like PBIS, or what would they do with students that got in trouble?
PBIS type stuff, yes, was a part of all the schools I worked in. As far as like violence and stuff goes, that was mostly what my frustration was a lack of consequences. I mean, there was just nothing done to discourage the behavior that mattered to the kids. Nothing I could do or the school was willing to do would hurt enough, emotionally for them to be like, ooh, maybe I shouldn't do that again, And when you have oftentimes parents who are not viewing you as an ally, they're not really helping you with that. They're not really backing you up. So it's like you're the only one advocating for like helping this student. I didn't see any of those an effective response, in my opinion, to violence. And in every school I worked in, like daily violence was like given. Like it wasn't a rare incident. Like it was a rare day if only one classroom had an incident. I would send kids to the office for throwing chairs, flipping their desk, that kind of stuff. And they would come back like not even de-escalated. Like they were still like in emotional crisis, and the principal would like bring them back. Or half the time, nobody would come until 30 minutes later, even though they say, when this happens, call me. And so there was just like no meaningful immediate consequences, which when stuff like that happens, there has to be. Because like if any of us goes out and does that in public, like we're getting arrested, right? And like not that everything should be fear-based, but like I feel like we're allowing these kids to fail to learn that like you can't walk around and like randomly commit violence on people. You're gonna have bad outcomes doing that, right? And like let's teach them that now before they end up in prison or something like that, right? Like we can make that lesson a lot less painful right now than it would be later for them, and that's another thing that's frustrating for me is like when it comes to like having standards for students and making exceptions for especially marginalized students and having lower standards for them. It's like, well, they're at greater risk of being punished for those behaviors in our society. So we especially I think we have gone way too far to the side of trying to avoid discipline because it's painful, because we think any pain is traumatic. And I don't think that's true. I think you can teach things in disciplinary ways that are momentarily painful, but that are actually meaningful. And it's actually in my opinion, a lot easier and a lot more effective than trying to reactively respond to violence every time it happens.
Totally agree. Yeah, you just kind of reminded me of a little bit of a back and forth debate I had with a social worker in the comments of one of my videos, because I think it's not just her opinion. It's really interesting. A lot of the people that are in the mental health profession, like social workers and counselors, and a lot of people that make these policies really have an aversion to having consequences. And they have this idea that, if you just talk to them or if you just process with them, or if you can just, see why they're doing what they're doing, then that's going to put it into the misbehavior. And this particular person was telling me, if you just had more engaging lessons, if you had your environment set up this way, it wouldn't happen. What would you say to somebody like that, since you were actually in situations where kids were doing all these crazy behaviors?
Well, I've been told that, and that's gaslighting. I mean, I'm telling you what's happening. You think I haven't tried to invest in relationships? You think I haven't tried any of the things that I have a master's degree in before saying, I don't know what to do because nothing I do can fix this. I understand that perspective, and I would say I entered into teaching probably a little more with that perspective than I do now. I mean, I definitely still think that restorative justice is important. I think it plays a role, and I think PBIS plays a role as well, because many kids are motivated by positive consequences, but it doesn't work for everyone. And some people, and I'm one of them, only really learns lessons when consequences happen. You have to fail to learn things. And failing to have consequences is not, serving those kids well, because every year we pass them on, they are another year behind socially, emotionally, academically, everything else, which then makes the burden of trying to close that gap just gets so unreasonably large. One school I was at, we had, I think, a third of our students were passing or meeting standard on the standardized tests in third grade, which is what I taught. And third grade was the first year that was assessed. And they were like, well, we need to get our scores up, which is like, a good goal to have. My principal comes and says, okay, we're going to identify like your low performing students or your below standard students, specifically the ones that are more than one grade level below. And we're going to try, and our target is going to be to raise those students 2 grade levels this year to get them back on track. And like, I'm all for ambitious goals, but that's entirely unreasonable because they haven't been learning even 1 grade level a year. Like, how is that even possible? And so it feels like sometimes the standards and the goals that are set are just totally unreasonably unachievable. And yeah, it's frustrating.
Definitely. That reminds me of a story that happened when I was in my second year of teaching. And there was this student that was 4 grade levels behind, and I was teaching 4th grade. And so I just remember the little student success team meeting where I was told, you have to get him on grade level by the end of the year. And this was at a fairly high performing some excellent teachers. And I'm thinking, I'm a new teacher, and the 4 teachers, before him couldn't do it yet. I'm supposed to do this miracle, and it is really frustrating. Definitely.
There's a lot of gaslighting. Same with parents too, where like the same kind of thing where when parents have an adversarial attitude, you call them and say like, hey, your kid did this thing. And they're like personally insulted by it and get offended and like want to argue with you about that. Or they'll assume that the kid's has more integrity than I do. And I'm like, come on, every child lies, every adult lies. You know that. It's frustrating because it's like, look, I'm not coming to you to like tell you your kid's a criminal. Like I'm saying I care about your kid. They did this concerning behavior that you probably don't want them to do as well. So like, let's work together to do that. And it's the same thing as like, oftentimes when you go to administration and ask for help, it's just like always thrown back on you as like, well, maybe the real problem is like something you're doing, right? Like your instructional isn't good enough. You're not building enough relationships. You're not doing this. You're not doing that. And oftentimes it's like, there's limitations to what I'm able to do, right? Like I do my best to build relationships, and I think that's important, but like I can't spend hours per day having private conferences with students, I would like to be able to do that because I care about these kids and I want to do that, but like in the environment I'm in, I can't do that. So I need help. And it just felt like every time you asked for help, there was such an uphill battle to ever actually get any resources. It was always like, oh, here's a book. Here's more work for you. Why don't you go read a book and like implement strategies and like fill out this worksheet and come talk to me about it. And I was like, I'm telling you, I can't do the work that you gave me already. Don't give me more. I'm saying like take some stuff away from me.
I'm glad you mentioned the thing about how parents are so reluctant to believe teachers. It's the weirdest thing ever. Like I even recall sitting in parent-teacher conferences and I would be telling a parent, this is what your child is doing. The parent would proceed to look at the child and say, Billy, is this true? And
Did you do that?
I literally just told you. And it was so frequently I would, call home and tell a parent about something that their child was doing. And their parent with, a straight face would say, oh, well, they said that didn't happen. Just like period, end of sentence. And it's just a very weird society we have now. And I would find kind of similar things with administration. I'd be talking to them about a problem I would have with a student. And there'd be this attitude, well, let's find out what the student says. And I get that there's like validity to like having kids share their experiences, but it seems like in so many instances, the teacher is the last person to be believed. And it's a crazy world.
Yeah, we're not treated like we have any integrity. And we're told all this stuff about like give grace to everyone about everything, and like no one ever gives us grace about anything.
Definitely.
Yeah. So I mean, and like the example I gave before about this kid who pushed over this disabled woman, and I went to my principal and I was like, you have to do something about this. He's like intimidating women, right? Like this is like a 12-year-old boy who's like 150 pounds and he already knows he can intimidate women, and he's doing that. And he was just like, it's not that big of a deal. I had a boy literally pull the hijab off of a girl's head, take like the collection bin of the pencil sharpener, dump it on her head, and like rub it into her hair. Wow. And I went to the principal and was like, you have to do something about this. Oh, I don't think he knew what he was doing. I said, no, he was trying to be as publicly as offensive as possible. He knows exactly what he was doing.
That's another thing that I have found really strange. It seems like a collective refusal to believe that kids can be malicious and cruel and bullies. I cannot tell you how many times a kid would do something terrible and a parent would say something like, oh, I don't think that they really understood what they did. And it's so bizarre. I'm like, do you not remember being a kid? Kids can be so mean and so cruel. And it's like this collective, amnesia about what children can be like. And it's really bizarre.
I find that's the same parents who like to pretend that they never make mistakes themselves too, like that's one of the weird things about education is like there's no room for accepting that people make mistakes, and you can call them out and still care about them, right? Like it's not loving, in my opinion, to not call students, their kids out, whether they're your students or your biological children, right? Like the loving thing isn't to allow them to do things are harmful to themselves, right?
Yeah. It seems like such common sense wisdom. And it's kind of good that, we're going this direction, because a lot of people talk about, the school to prison pipeline. And it's really interesting because when I was younger, the focus was on illiteracy and how basically, if kids are not at a certain reading level by third grade, then there's a correlation between that and like people that go to jail. But just,
Right.
I was researching it again, and it was fascinating. All of that part of the narrative was gone. And it was all about how schools are punishing kids too much. Schools are expelling kids too much. Schools are calling resource officers. And that's the, school to prison pipeline. And it was just really confusing to me. But in light of the weird changes, it makes sense that they're essentially saying because schools are or were disciplining and punishing kids, that's putting them in jail. And it's completely crazy. I actually think it's the opposite. It's lowering standards, not giving kids consequences that is leading to them believing they can go out into the world and commit crimes and everything will be fine.
Yeah, I have mixed feelings about that. I think when the term school to prison pipeline first came out, it was like talking about something that actually exists, which is disproportionate and biased outcomes and discipline. And I think that continues to be a problem. And it didn't just go away because we stopped punishing anyone, And I think the idea was like, well, we're trying to respond to that and recognize this trend, but it's led to, I think, going too far. Like you said, there's now a reluctance to punish kids. I would say especially Black kids, for example, because I don't know, there's just like this attitude amongst most educators. It's like their life is hard enough. And it's like, I mean, that might be true, but like life is hard for everyone as well. And like, if you don't learn how to act and behave, like it's going to be a lot harder for them. And it's frustrating. Yeah, I think we've become way too permissive. And I think a lot of that has to do with like white people just arriving to like talking about race and acknowledging it's a thing. And now they're like, oh, I'm going to look racist, And like, I on a personal level, that's something people should be worried about, but that shouldn't drive you to have double standards. That's racist in itself, right? And so, and especially if you're saying, oh, this group of kids is disadvantaged and is more likely to be harshly punished for the same behavior out in society, then having lower standards for them is like doubly racist, because now we're actually further contributing to the likelihood that something bad could happen to them. And I agree with what you said too, is like, I've wanted to have this conversation with many kids, but of course I didn't, because it wouldn't be acceptable. But like, I wanted to talk to a bunch of boys in particular and be like, look, if a random person in the grocery store comes up and starts like punching me, even if they're a little child, like I'm allowed to fight back. They don't understand that. And it's, I don't know. It sounds like I'm saying like kids need violence, and that's not what I'm saying. It's just like violence is a reality, and especially in a lot of these kids' lives already, right? Like they already witness a lot of it or experience it too. And so I just think that we're really failing to connect for a lot of kids, especially the ones who are, I would say, most likely to commit or be victims of violence. We're failing to connect for them that like that's not going to turn out well, right? Like, yeah, it's really disappointing. And I think having low standards, like I said, is like as counterproductive as it gets.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. It is definitely something really hard to articulate to people, but I 100% understand what you're saying, because my view and the way my parents raised me, they basically said there are racist people. Basically, yes. Don't give them fuel. So it's like if people already look at Black kids and think that they're uncivilized and wild and disrespectful, and then they come to sub at an all Black school and the kids are terrorizing everybody and ripping stuff up and acting insane.
Yeah.
That is crazy to me to like encourage that behavior. The thing that I
Right.
tried to talk to my students, because I felt like I could, basically was that, yes, like there are people that are still racist in 2023. So you have to hold yourself high. You have to have manners. You have to have an education. You have to be articulate because, you know, nobody's going to give you a break. And I think that we've gone to this weird other extreme where it's actually almost encouraging, you know, Black inner city children to be wild, be disrespectful, don't do your work, don't, you know, hold yourself to any standards. And if anybody points it out, then that's racist. So it's just this crazy pendulum swing that doesn't make any sense at all.
Super reactive. I feel like that's everything in education. Like, I mean, on like the micro level and the bigger level too. I feel like it's always like teachers saying like, I foresee this problem. This is coming. This is coming. This is coming. And then like something crazy happens. And then we have a reactive response.
So a lot of people discuss that teaching is one of the most stressful professions on the planet. What were your levels like in terms of just like stress and mental health in teaching?
So I had mental health problems long before I was into teaching. I've had depression and anxiety problems since about 5th grade. And started therapy, being medicated around 20, and then I was about 25 when I started teaching. So all that, I said, just to get some history, that was all pre-existing, but it was never as bad as it was when I was teaching. You know, essentially the first time I quit was because of mental health, and it wasn't because I wanted to. You know, like I basically was forced to because I was in a crisis. So, and it's frustrating because I had worked at my first school for a full school year. And it was tough. And then I started the next school year. And early on, I had been talking to my principal, been talking to my colleague, like, I'm struggling. This is not going well. You know, like the signs are here that I'm not doing well. I'm worried about making through this, right? And I think, like I said before, when I had like asked for help with things, like there was never anything taken off my plate. And I was having these conversations. I was like, basically like, something's got to give, you know, like this isn't sustainable. Anyways, I felt I was proactive about that. I talked about it for several months. Nothing was done. And then, you know, eventually one day, so it was at the point where, you know, I'm a very sensitive person, but this was a sign to me that maybe I'm overly sensitive because I'm worn out, right? You know, I was crying every day, morning and night, usually, like on the way to work, leaving work. And it wasn't even like sadness. It was just like, I'm so overwhelmed, you know? Yeah. So that was going for several months. And like I said, I had been talking about it, and I was like telling it like, this is happening. Like, this is not a normal thing to have, you know, healthy behavior. Yeah. Then one day I was driving to work and I had this just like fleeting fantasy of like, oh, I could just like turn into oncoming traffic, you know? And that was like, it was like laughable almost because I knew how ridiculous it was. But I also knew is like that even popping in my head was like a huge indicator, like problems, you know, things are not going well. So that day I basically went to my principal at lunch and said, this happens morning, like, you know, something's got to change. I don't know what it is. And thankfully I wasn't a big fan of her, but I think she did proper with this. She was like, okay, just go home. And it was like a week or a week and a half before winter break. And so I was like, all right, well, I'm just going to take off through winter break and see what happens after was kind of the initial plan. And, you know, just another example of just like not being taken seriously. You know, I was advocating very clearly. I was doing everything I was supposed to do, right? And then I went and talked to my colleague before I left that day. And I was like, told her what was going on and I'm leaving till after break, you know, just telling her that. And her response was essentially like, oh, well, this is going to make my life harder. And this is a woman who had told me her first or second year that she was taken from the school in an ambulance because she was having panic attacks. And I'm just like, come on, you know, like just no empathy when it's necessary. And so that was in 2017. That was the first time I quit. And it wasn't intended to be a quit at first, but I was like definitely not fine to go back by the time my leave was up. And then, so I took some time off and was like, I need some time away. Yeah. And it took me a couple of years, honestly, to like recover in therapy and stuff like that. I think like, yeah, I don't know what to call it. I mean, I suppose it's PTSD. So that happened. I always had this goal that like I was going to return to teaching, and that was a temporary break, right? Because that was like not the way I wanted to go out if it was going to happen. So I was like, all right, I'm going to work around as a para, try and find a school that I feel has an acceptable environment and try and like get a teaching job there, right? Because I came to the conclusion that either this profession is toxic or my workplace was toxic. But I didn't have enough data to know which of those was true. Anyways, so I went to a different district that was a suburban district. In general, better resource, fewer problems, but definitely not zero problems. And I was a para there for a couple of years. I actually got hired as a para. They had a restorative justice center, and I was hired specifically to be like someone to implement that, like with difficult kids, like to be a person to call and to like process through that with them, which I was like, cool, because in my experience, I'd never been able to do that as a teacher, right? And sometimes I was like, that's what's necessary. But it was the same thing. It was like, basically, it became clear that my job was to de-escalate kids and then talk to them about why they were violent, and then there was never consequences. And so it just, after a while, that got frustrating to me because it just didn't feel like we were aligned with the philosophy that we said we were aligned with, or we weren't implementing it very well. But yeah, I did that for about 2 years. And then I had an opportunity I was like, all right, well, I'm ready to try teaching again. I was kind of skeptical. I was like, I still think it might not go well, but I feel like I need to give this a second shot. And that was at the beginning of the 2021 school year. And so the first bad sign was I got recommended for this job because the person who was hired into it quit on day 2.
Wow.
And my principal was like, oh, I know you're trying to look for a job, because I was applying at that point. And anyways, went there and decided to give it a chance. And within 2 months, like by December, I was like clearly noticing like I'm going down the same path mental health wise. Like I definitely didn't get anywhere near as deep because I actually was able to like recognize the descent. But I remember specifically like there was a Sunday in December and I went to Portland with my friend, and then we went to a comedy show and we went camping, and like the whole weekend I just was like not present. I wasn't enjoying it. I was super anxious and overwhelmed. And I was like, this is how I used to feel all the time back when I was teaching the first time. And now I've recreated that burden in my life. And so I went and quit the next day. Disappointing, but I feel like I did my diligence. I gave it its chance. At this point, I just concluded like it's a super toxic profession. And I don't want to ride like the sinking ship down with it, like I'm not okay with myself doing that. And honestly, it's kind of frustrating to me and surprising to see how many people are still in education and haven't said enough, like the level of like martyrdom and like tolerance that is expected of just insane things, There's still people who are like not jaded. To me is it's a weird aspect of the culture where like that's the level of like abusiveness. It's like an abusive relationship where like people are so far removed from how terrible their experience is that like no one is, or it's that they're like so self-denying that they won't do anything for themselves, because I just see a lot of people who are really unhappy. I see a lot of people who are like getting all these health problems. Their relationships are suffering. Ruined one of my relationships, failed when I was teaching, and they just like keep doing it. I'm like, it's frustrating to see because I have a lot of friends still in it, and I respect the passion and I have it too. But I guess maybe they just haven't had their point like I did, where I was like, I can't do this if I want to, Like maybe they just haven't had quite that deep of a failure. But yeah, I'm real worried about the future of education. It's not going in a good direction.
Definitely. So I know a lot of people that are non-teachers have a perception of teaching as such an easy job. Can you kind of tell us what were some of the things as a teacher that just stressed you to the point of breaking? What were some of those like daily factors like, in your opinion?
Well, the workload is insane. I mean, just from like all the administrative work that you need to do, not just like the stuff you need to do as far as planning goes, which is a ton, by the way. You're supposed to you're supposed to give like 5 hours of presentation per day, and you're given 30 minutes to prepare for that, which seems unreasonable. Like in any other profession, when someone has a presentation, they have like 2 weeks to prepare for a 30-minute presentation. So aside from what you need to do just to like teach, develop your instruction and stuff, there's all kinds of other expectations put on you. Like I said, there's like this very strong martyrdom culture where you're expected to volunteer for all kinds of unpaid things. And if you don't, like, you're not a team player. And a ton of meetings, IEP meetings, staff meetings, things like that, which should be productive but don't feel productive. So it feels like wasted time. My planning time was often taken away because I was told to go teach another classroom because there's no subs. I would say it feels like you're not set up with the situation that you could realistically like achieve the not just your personal goals, but also separate from that, the goals that your boss puts on you. The things that they try and put on you are like not achievable, given the environment. And then, when you get data that supports that, it's like, well, what do we need to do to develop you as a teacher? Right. And it's just insane. I mean, I know so many teachers who, like I said, never had mental illness until they became a teacher, developed an anxiety disorder and medicated now, and are, spend their whole weekend stressing about work. And aside from that, it's super stressful to spend hours and hours planning really intentionally what you're going to teach, and to not be able to get through even like 10% of that without someone always like harassing you and the rest of the class, like with disruption. I found it really hard to like recover from that constantly. Just like the frustration of like everything always being disrupted, nothing ever going anywhere near as it was planned, always having to adapt. And just like there was always just like this element of unknown chaos that like could spring up at any time that you had to respond to, and still like be a great instructor at the same time that you're trying to, tell this kid to stop throwing chairs,
So how were your relationships with your coworkers? Because I really found that the atmosphere and the environment of a school amongst like admin and coworkers can make or break an experience. So did you find your fellow co-teachers to be supportive, or did you have challenges with them?
Both. I think, I definitely found a couple people that I felt pretty supported with. But then I also had experiences, like I told you, with my colleague when I told her about that I was taking time off. Yeah, there's a mix. I think I definitely felt there was some people that I felt I was really aligned with in terms of like my intentions and my priorities and values of like being there in the school. But I did feel like there was a lot that I really wasn't with. I felt there's a lot of toxicity amongst teachers, like socially, like with your colleagues. There was just like a lot. Number one, there was like a ton of gossip. Number two, there was it just felt like really toxically competitive. It just didn't feel like people trying to look out for other people's interests. And I don't know how to explain it really, but there was this weird sort of like high school dynamic socially to it. That was like, like the group of cool kids and then like the outcasts, and like, I don't know. It was just a weird social game where instead of just like treating each other as like professional colleagues, and like in the same way where like when you go to an administrator and you get gaslit about saying like, this happened to me, half my colleagues would do the same thing, half of them would be like, I believe you. And half of them would be like, well, did you try this? Or did you try that? And so there's very much a huge chunk of I would say the teaching population that is like fully drank the Kool-Aid and like for some reason like isn't like noticing that like education is on fire and it's an emergency and we need to do something now. And so that's kind of difficult to be around.
So there was a lot of talk when I was in the classroom about experiencing vicarious trauma. Did you ever feel like that was a factor at all in your situation?
One of the things I realized that led to my first mental health crisis, or my first quitting situation, was like I took everything way too seriously. I was like, I cared way too much about everything, right? Which then made it that much more painful and disappointing when I felt I was surrounded by, not to say there was no good, but there was just an abundance of dysfunction and failure that was really difficult for me to like ignore and be like toxically optimistic, I'm actually a pretty optimistic person in general, but I'm frustrated that oftentimes that seems to mean ignore the negative stuff and pretend it's not there. Anyways, so I think just being surrounded by all of that chaos and definitely like contributed to my depression and anxiety. I mean, my anxiety got a lot worse. I added another medication while I was teaching that I'm still on, like 5+ years later. It doesn't look like it's going to go away. So definitely, and it's super hard to hear. On top of that, it's super hard to hear from kids the stuff they experience, As a very like sensitive, empathetic person, I definitely like struggled with like emotional boundaries as well, I would say. And I had to learn that like, it's easy to feel in a lot of situations like I am the only advocate for this kid, and to like accept it as my responsibility, which isn't fair for one kid, but then you do that for like 30 and, it's really an unreasonable burden to put on yourself. And I think that's a source of trauma for a lot of people is they just like overload themselves emotionally, overestimate their resilience and things like that, and then get just like totally broken down. Not to mention, it's just terrible to hear stories from kids about the stuff they experience. It's really hard.
Definitely. So you worked in about 8 different schools. Did you notice a lot of difference between the funding that the school got, or what was What were some of the issues with that when you were working at all of these different schools?
Even though there are big differences, education in general still seems drastically underfunded because, even in what I would consider the better resource schools I've worked in, I think we were tragically failing, like everywhere I've ever been didn't have enough staff. And including the last place I worked, which had a decent PTA. So they had enough PTA funding to hire several full-time staff. So we're talking like several $100,000 a year, right? And so that was a special privilege we had, was to be able to hire those staff, and we still were short-staffed with them, So it's like, you can't really make up the deficit. But there's also huge differences just in the environment. I mean, some of the school buildings that kids are educated in are just like disgraceful. I mean, the first one I was in, it was unbelievable. I was on the third floor. The windows opened up all the way, and I was like, there needs to be like a window jam. Of course, a girl tried to crawl out the window, and I had to like grab her and pull her in. She's screaming about, "You're a man, you can't touch me." I'm just like, this is such a bad situation.
Wow.
And same school. There was they had come to do some maintenance, and so there was this like brick wall, an interior wall that they had opened up to do something interior, and they didn't finish it, but they needed to come back. They didn't like clean it up or cover it. They just left this exposed like half open brick wall. They went back into like some, I don't know, basement chamber behind it or something. Like, we don't know what was back there. And there was like rubble and like pieces of bricks. And of course, kids grabbed them and were throwing them at each other and stuff. It's just like, it's so obvious that that's a problem. And, of course that happens a lot more at some schools than others, but I would say all the schools I was at struggling with resources. I mean, some of them had really nice buildings, but they weren't resourced well with staff, Yeah, but that building was it was like 100 years old, and it was unbelievable how bad there was signs still up from like, I don't know, 10 plus years ago. Water had like showed, I don't know, toxic lead levels or something like that. And they put signs that said at that time, you can't drink the water. Apparently it had been fixed, but no one took those signs down in like 15 years. So everyone who walked in the classroom was like, oh, toxic lead water. It's like the lack of awareness of messaging is amazing sometimes.
So there's been kind of a lot of back and forth that people have had about standards-based grading versus the traditional A through F grading system, and whether or not we should give zeros or whether everyone should get a 50 no matter what. What are some of the trends that you saw in your region in terms of grading? And did you ever get the message that everybody has to pass? Were you ever encouraged to fudge test scores? What was that like in your situation?
I think everywhere I worked had already shifted to standards-based. I mean, I know that I've heard thousands of stories of, I know especially at the secondary level, that's a huge issue in terms of like being told literally you can't give zeros and things like that. At my level, I didn't feel the level of pressure that other people feel, but I did feel some pressure. I felt that, for example, I was reluctant to give an accurate report card, right? Because it would look too negative. When I was like, I'm just reporting where this kid is compared to the standard. That's what you asked me to do, right? And also, how are we going to get them help if we don't actually document where they are? So I did feel some pressure about that, which was frustrating. And I do know of schools where the principal had to review every report card and would go in and change the teacher's comments and stuff like that if they were negative and all kinds of things like that. Even if we could give them zeros, they won't hold any student back ever. So I wish we could give zeros, because that's an important lesson to learn, is failure and consequences as well. Doesn't take usually too many times of that before you learn your lesson. But yeah, it's just frustrating because, like, for example, I just had so many kids that were effectively 3 years younger academically, emotionally, socially than their age. And it's like, not holding this kid back is like widening that gap more and more and more every year. Yeah, I just wish there was, I don't have a problem with standards-based grading so much. I do wish there was more like benchmark, like proficiency tests. Like, to go to fourth grade, you need to show proficiency in this. And if you don't show all those things, then you have to get additional instruction in one of those or be held back or whatever. But just like saying, oh, well, you didn't get this and you're just going to get caught up next year is like, come on, we know that's not going to happen. The harm caused to this kid socially by holding them back is way better than them not getting math the rest of their entire schooling, That's going to impact their life way more than being embarrassed for a few days.
Definitely. So what do you wish that the general public understood about a teacher's job? And this could be what you wish students, parents, admins, society, anybody. Like, what do you wish people really understood about the state of education today compared to when they probably went to school?
I'd say the biggest thing is just like how chaotic the environment is. I don't think people realize like how non-conducive to learning it is. And not to say that should be our only goal, but it is one of our goals. Parents assume, 90% of what's happening there is education. And in my experience, that's not what's happening. So, and on top of that, like there's just a lot of wasted time as a result of that. As we have higher standards and which I think are good, it then becomes more important to optimize and be efficient with our resources and things like that. And there's kind of this cultural undercurrent that's like, oh, schools are wasteful. Like, don't give them anything else, right? Because they're just going to waste the money. I don't know. That's frustrating, especially when you like witness the ways that they actually don't use it well. It really undermines the whole argument to begin with. Yeah, I think in general, we need way more funding for education, way more staff, like double the staff. Like we need to cut ratios in half. We need to have way more counselors, administrators, people who can respond when you need one adult to take one student away from the group and you can't do it. Having gone through the American education myself and then now having been a teacher in it, I'm extremely worried about the future of it. I'm extremely worried about this like generation of kids. I mean, I already even see it with, I would say, the parents who are like young 20s now. So some of the parents of like elementary age kids. So I graduated high school in 2008. And I think that time it was definitely starting to shift towards what it's kind of the things we're complaining about now. And so I think that like people who are, like 10-ish years younger than me, a lot of them are like now in their 20s and like young adulthood. And what I see in them, the like impulsiveness, lack of discipline, they weren't given consequences as kids. And I see like how that's it manifesting in them as adults and now adults with kids who are in the same environment. And, like, I feel like we've already seen like enough of we know how this is going to turn out and we've seen it. And I hope that our culture gets the will to improve it. I don't know that it will. I'm skeptical. I would like education to improve. I want it to be good. We'll have to see what happens.
I'm curious, at the elementary level, did you notice the impact yet of social media and cell phones? Because we all know that that's a big problem in middle school and high school, but did you see that at all in elementary school?
It wasn't a huge problem. It wasn't a huge problem, to be honest. Most of them weren't really on social media, and if they were, it was like TikTok, and they just were annoying about doing dances. Like that's about the extent of it. We didn't have to deal with all like the cyberbullying aspect of it and the constant arguing, and half the kids didn't have phones, so there was just like much less battles about it. But in terms of like using classroom technology appropriately, that was a big issue. They couldn't use an iPad without doing something else on it and then getting so hyper focused that like you cannot get them off of it. So definitely I would say those signs of technology addiction and things were definitely there, just not so much the social media aspect of it.
That makes sense. So was there anything that was good that you look back on and think, I'm so glad that I experienced this, or I really made a difference? Or when you look back on teaching, is it mostly like a gray cloud?
No, there definitely was good things. I mean, I definitely had a whole bunch of awesome relationships with kids and parents. For every complaint I've had, I feel I can think of at least one example. It's a counterexample to that, so it definitely wasn't all negative. I've definitely had some really impactful relationships with kids, and like, I went into teaching wanting to have an impact on kids who are struggling, and I've definitely been like, had instances with kids where I felt like I made a meaningful difference and had a meaningful impact and got kind of the satisfaction out of that that was my intention. There's definitely good aspects to it. It's just, I think it needs a lot of improvement, and it's difficult, and I don't think that gets enough respect. It's really hard.
Definitely. So let's imagine that there is somebody that is really excited about becoming a teacher and they're going to teacher college. What advice or warnings would you give to that person to prepare them?
I wouldn't say don't do it. I would say be cautious, though. I think that it's a profession that attracts idealistic people who then get their dreams crushed when they realize how bad it is. So I've noticed that it seems like the teachers that last are the ones that aren't as passionate about it and are a little bit more emotionally disconnected. And it's the ones who take it really seriously and absorb a lot of that emotional energy of it that get burned out and overwhelmed. So I'd say this is actually something I was thinking about. I was thinking about, what was missing from my teacher education program. And I named a few things before, but I feel like they also need to give like direct attention to this is really stressful. So you need to have good coping skills. And what I see is, I mean, it's true for me, but I see it for a lot of people too, especially like people who are, a lot of people I graduated from my master's with were like 22 straight from undergrad. Like they hadn't had any work experience or things like that. So I think we're throwing a lot of people who haven't realized the importance of cultivating like resilience and emotional strength and things like that into environments that are going to just like destroy them and break them down, And so I guess I would say you have to really know yourself very well. You have to be very self-aware. You have to be very emotionally in touch with yourself. You have to also be willing to set boundaries for yourself. And I think that's something that is difficult for empathetic people in general, people that end up in teaching. I didn't learn this until after my experiences, but you have to like love yourself more than you love your kids and your job, because you're not going to do your job well if you're not doing well. And if you don't have good self-love and you don't have good coping strategies, you're going to probably have a really hard time coping, because it is very stressful and it's very isolating and lonely too. You probably have to do this anyways for your program, so never mind. But I would say volunteer, just go witness and see if it's something that you think you could do, because I think like we've talked about, people's perception of what they think happens and what actually happens is quite different. Yeah, but I think if you see it and you feel like you have the strength for it, you should pursue it. Definitely. I just wish that there was more. If you're not in therapy, start it. Let's put it that way.
Totally agreed. I think that's great advice. And I do like the advice about volunteering. I get a lot of people that ask, how will I know if I would enjoy being a teacher? And I suggest to those people to get like a little subbing license and just spend some time at least substitute teaching, or if they have the time, even to be a para, just to be immersed in the classroom and really get a sense of what it feels like. So that's really great advice.
I agree with the para thing. I think that's actually even better than volunteering, because you get more inside view of things and you get to see how it really works. A lot of times when you're a volunteer, you get a false sense because there's an extra adult around to help with things, So I think working as a para, if you're unsure, work as a para for like a school year, and that should give you enough time to have a realistic view of what you're getting into, and then you can make a decision about it. Yeah.
Well, thank you, Kevin, so much for everything you shared with us, and thank you for being so vulnerable about your journey. I know that it's kind of hard for a lot of teachers to talk about mental health struggles and burnout, but I think your journey is going to be really helpful for a lot of people. So thank you so much for coming. And for my audience, if you have any questions for Kevin, you can type them in the comment section. If you have video ideas for the future, let me know. And if you want to interview with me, you can email me. My email is in the description. So we'll see you guys next time. Thank you so much. Bye.